The date was March 19, 2026, and for millions of people around the world, it arrived like a punch they never saw coming, not a rumor this time. Not one of those fabricated headlines that spread like wildfire every few years, borrowing his name for clicks and leaving his family scrambling to issue denials. This time the statement was real. This time the words came directly from the people who loved him most. This time there were no corrections, no retractions, no follow-up posts explaining it was a hoax. Chuck Norris was gone. 86 years old, surrounded by his family, at peace, according to those who were present in that room when the silence finally, gently settled over everything. And yet somehow, even knowing all of that, the world still wasn't ready. Because there are certain people whose deaths feel structurally impossible, people so deeply woven into the memory of an entire generation that when the news arrives, the mind pauses, resists, reaches instinctively for some version of the story where it isn't true. People whose presence had been so constant, so solid, so quietly dependable across so many decades that their absence doesn't just register as loss. It registers as a change in the shape of things. A gap where something permanent used to be. He was one of those people. But here is what the breaking news alerts didn't say, what the tribute montages couldn't capture, what the comment sections, flooded within minutes with shocked, grieving goodbyes from every corner of the world, couldn't quite reach. Behind the legend, behind 8 seasons of Walker, behind the roundhouse kicks and the action films and the internet jokes that had somehow made him more immortal in digital culture than any film ever had. Behind all of it, there was a real man. A man living through something profoundly, quietly human. A man who had already faced something far more difficult than anything fame had ever thrown at him. A man who had spent years standing in the shadow of his wife's suffering, stepping away from everything he had built. Everything that had defined him publicly, without asking for a single moment of recognition in return. A man whose final chapter was never really about Hollywood at all. He was born Carlos Ray Norris on March 10, 1940 in Ryan, Oklahoma, a small town. The kind of place that doesn't appear on maps people actually use. His father, Ray Norris, was defined by 2 things: alcohol and absence. His mother, Wilma, was the one who kept the family standing, quietly and without complaint, in the particular way that women of that era and that circumstance learned to do out of sheer necessity. The family moved constantly. Stability was not something they owned. And young Carlos absorbed that reality early, learning, the way children do when the ground beneath them keeps shifting, that security was never something you could take for granted. He was shy. Not in a surface way, in a deeper way. The shyness of a child who had already figured out that drawing attention to yourself rarely ended in anything good. He didn't stand out in school. He didn't collect achievements or recognition. He moved through his early years largely invisible, which is a particular kind of loneliness when the person making you invisible is your own father. The military gave him something he hadn't had before, not instantly, not in a single moment of transformation, but steadily, the way water eventually reshapes stone without ever forcing anything. He enlisted in the United States Air Force in 1958 and was stationed in South Korea, where he encountered Tang Soo Do martial arts almost by accident, the way the most important discoveries in a life often arrive. Something in it found a home inside him immediately: the discipline, the structure. The profound, clarifying idea that the body could be built into something reliable, something consistent, something you could count on when almost nothing else in your life had ever offered that. He came home a different person, still quiet, still private, but carrying for the first time something that functioned like a foundation. He began teaching martial arts in California and trained with a dedication that edged close to obsession, eventually becoming a 6-time undefeated world professional middleweight karate champion. He trained alongside Bruce Lee, a friendship that sharpened him in ways that competition alone never could. That pushed his understanding of martial arts from technique into something closer to philosophy. When Hollywood eventually found him, drawn by the particular gravity that genuinely compelling people tend to generate, he was never the most technically polished actor in the room. His early films were rough, uneven in places, but the camera found something in him that training cannot manufacture and directors cannot instruct: authenticity. You believed him. You believed the stillness in his eyes. You believed, watching him move through a scene, that if something went wrong, he would handle it. And audiences, it turned out, had been waiting a long time for exactly that feeling. A career was built, film by film, decade by decade. until the man who had started as an invisible boy in a small Oklahoma town had become something closer to a cultural institution, a shorthand for a particular kind of American strength that the 1980s and 1990s were deeply, almost desperately hungry for. He was, by almost any honest measure, a man who had constructed something extraordinary from almost nothing at all. And for a long time, a very long time, that construction held perfectly. By the early 2000s, Chuck Norris had settled into a version of life that most people spend entire lifetimes reaching for and never quite touch. Walker, Texas Ranger had completed its 8-season run in 2001, leaving behind a cultural footprint that stretched far beyond any television rating. The show had been translated into dozens of languages, broadcast in countries where English was barely spoken, and somehow, across all of those different places, all of those different cultures, people had understood exactly what Chuck Norris represented. Justice without performance, quiet strength, a man who never announced his values because he was too busy living them. He had remarried in 1998. Gina O'Kelly, a former model and actress, 17 years younger, was, by all available evidence, the person who completed something in him that decades of professional success had never quite reached. They built their life on a ranch in Navasota, Texas, deliberate, grounded, removed from the relentless, exhausting noise of Los Angeles. In 2001, Gina gave birth to twins Dakota and Danielle, and the family portrait that resulted looked, from every possible angle, like a man who had found exactly where he was supposed to be. He kept working, but differently. The Expendables 2 in 2012 brought him back to mainstream audiences with something that felt genuinely celebratory. A man comfortable enough in his own legend to smile at it, to play with it, to let the audience in on the joke without ever diminishing what the legend actually meant. He wrote books, he maintained a column. He spoke about his Christian faith openly and without apology, not preaching, just sharing, in the direct and uncomplicated way of someone who had long since stopped calculating how it would land. People who knew him during those years consistently described someone who had genuinely settled into himself. Not softened, Chuck Norris never softened, but settled, and those are different things. The difference between a man still quietly fighting to establish something and a man who has nothing left to prove to anyone, including himself. He trained every morning with the methodical consistency of someone who had always treated the body as a long-term investment rather than something to be spent. He was disciplined. He was grounded. He was, to everyone watching, the picture of a man who would simply continue steady and purposeful and private for as many years as life allowed. Nobody was worried about Chuck Norris. That, looking back, was exactly the point. That was how thoroughly, how convincingly, he had constructed the image of a man beyond disruption. A man the ordinary machinery of misfortune simply couldn't touch, but disruption does not check credentials before it arrives. It doesn't consult reputations or weigh legacies. It simply comes, and it came to the Norris family not with drama, not with any kind of warning, but in the form of a scheduled medical appointment, a contrast dye injected into a vein, and an afternoon that started like every other afternoon and ended like nothing that had come before it. In 2013, Gina Norris went in for a series of MRI scans to investigate symptoms she had been experiencing. The procedure required gadolinium, a contrast agent used routinely in MRI imaging to help physicians see tissue and organs with greater clarity. It was standard practice, considered safe. Performed in imaging centers across the United States every single day on thousands of patients without incident. But something went wrong. Within hours of the procedure, Gina began experiencing a burning sensation that moved through her body in ways that were deeply unsettling, not localized, not manageable, but spreading through her limbs, deep into tissue, in ways that were difficult to describe and, as she would spend the following months discovering, profoundly difficult to diagnose. She returned for additional scans, more gadolinium was administered, and according to her own later account, with each subsequent exposure, the symptoms didn't stabilize, they intensified. What she was experiencing had a name: gadolinium deposition disease. A condition in which the contrast agent fails to fully clear the body following the procedure and instead accumulates in tissue, in bone, potentially in brain matter, over time. At the point Gina began suffering its effects, the condition was not widely recognized within mainstream medicine. Many physicians she encountered had never seen it. Some questioned openly whether it constituted a distinct diagnosis at all. And that uncertainty, The experience of suffering something real while being told by medical professionals that what you're experiencing may not exist was its own particular and exhausting form of cruelty. She moved from specialist to specialist. She underwent treatment after treatment. She spent time in clinics across the United States and eventually traveled abroad to facilities in Europe, seeking therapies and approaches that had not yet made their way into standard American medical practice. According to Chuck Norris, who would speak publicly about this period for the first time in 2017, there were multiple moments across those years when he sat beside his wife and genuinely, fully believed he was going to lose her. He described watching her burn from the inside. Those were his words, not a metaphor reached for in an interview, but the language of someone recounting something they had actually witnessed and never forgotten. A woman who had been vibrant and capable and present, becoming someone who could barely move through a day without pain. He described sitting in waiting rooms while physicians consulted notes and offered qualified, careful answers that ultimately amounted to very little certainty about anything at all. And he described the decision he made quietly, without announcement, without asking for permission or acknowledgement from anyone early in that process. He was going to be there every day. Every appointment, every long and frightening night when the burning hadn't stopped and the answers still hadn't come and the morning felt very far away, he stepped back from everything. Not gradually, not with a public explanation, not with a statement thanking fans for their understanding. He simply turned away from the world that had built him and turned toward the one person who needed him more than that world ever had. While Chuck Norris sat beside his wife in medical facilities, in Texas, in other states, eventually in clinics on another continent, the internet was busy constructing its own version of what his disappearance meant. The death hoaxes had been circulating long before any of this began. His name had always been reliable traffic. Post a fabricated obituary with enough specific, convincing detail and millions of people would share it before any correction could catch up. He had been killed in fictional car accidents, declared dead of invented heart failures, reported as having passed peacefully in his sleep by accounts that had never spoken to anyone close to him. His representatives had issued formal denials so many times that the cycle had started to feel almost routine. But the hoaxes that circulated during the years of Gina's illness felt different, at least to those paying close enough attention. Because this time the silence they were attempting to explain was genuinely there. He wasn't appearing publicly. He wasn't giving interviews. The absence that the fabricated headlines were reaching to account for was real. They were simply wrong about every single reason behind it. Tabloids offered their own explanations. Some suggested professional decline, others implied financial difficulty. A few floated the idea of falling outs with former collaborators, stories with enough surface plausibility to spread but no verifiable foundation beneath them. None of it was accurate. All of it filled the space that his deliberate and total privacy had created, because nature and the internet abhors a vacuum. What nobody reported, because nobody outside that family actually knew, was the reality. A man spending his days coordinating care across multiple countries, managing medications and treatment schedules, monitoring his wife's condition with the same focused, systematic intensity he had once brought to his training, because that was the only thing left to bring. According to later reports, the financial toll reached close to $9 million in medical expenses over those years. Not just the cost of American healthcare, but the cost of traveling internationally, repeatedly, in search of treatments that conventional medicine hadn't yet caught up to providing. They eventually filed a lawsuit against multiple pharmaceutical companies involved in gadolinium contrast production, raising questions, according to reports, about what patients had been told regarding the risks of retention and what, if anything, had been deliberately withheld. The lawsuit drew significant attention, and not only to their personal story. It drew attention to an entire community of patients who had been struggling for years to have gadolinium deposition disease taken seriously by mainstream medicine, patients who had been suffering without a diagnosis, without treatment, without acknowledgement that what they were experiencing was even real. Because Chuck Norris spoke, those patients were suddenly heard. That mattered in ways that extended far beyond one family's experience. But the private weight of those years, the specific psychological cost of living inside someone else's medical crisis, day after day. While the world outside assumes you've simply faded or failed, That cost doesn't appear in any lawsuit. It doesn't register in any headline, it lives only in the person who carried it. In 2017, Chuck and Gina Norris came forward. The interview they gave was long. Unguarded in a way that was almost startling from a man who had spent nearly his entire public life projecting containment. They described the years of illness with a specificity that left no interpretive distance. The fear, the deterioration, the moments when survival had felt genuinely uncertain. The feeling of spending everything they had and still not being sure it would be enough. They described all of it without self-pity, which is precisely what made it so difficult to sit with. Self-pity creates distance. Honesty without it pulls you closer than you're prepared for. Chuck Norris, sitting in front of a camera with his wife beside him, used a word that no one who had followed his career across 40 years would have predicted hearing from him: powerless. For a man whose entire public identity had been constructed on the premise that will and preparation and discipline could overcome any obstacle, that the body trained hard enough, the mind focused sharply enough could push through anything, that single word carried weight that a longer speech couldn't have matched. He had felt it completely, he was saying so plainly, and you could see in the steadiness of his jaw and the careful quiet of his voice that speaking that truth out loud cost him something real. The public response was immediate and to many observers surprising in its depth. People who had grown up watching him, who had absorbed some version of what strength was supposed to look like through his performances across 3 decades, found themselves moved by a version of him they had never encountered before. Not weakened, not diminished, something more nuanced than either of those things. A man who had been stripped of every layer of professional armor and had stood there anyway, faithful, present. Year after year, without credit, without audience, without any of the external structures that had always confirmed to the world who he was. Gina's condition had gradually improved. The burning had lessened. She was returning, carefully and incrementally, to something that resembled the life she had known before that MRI appointment in 2013. The European treatments had made a difference. Time had made a difference. And the quiet, unwavering presence of a husband who had refused, at every point, under every pressure, to look away had made a difference in ways that no medical chart could accurately capture. The legal questions raised by the lawsuit remained, according to reports, without final public resolution at that time. Questions about what had been known, what had been communicated, what accountability might look like, those questions continued moving through the legal system. Part of a broader conversation that extended well beyond one family's story. No official conclusion had been reached. The matter, in significant ways, remained open. But what the interview had accomplished, what Chuck Norris choosing to speak had accomplished, was something quieter and more lasting than any legal outcome. It had reminded a world that had spent decades consuming his myth that the man behind it was exactly that. A man, frightened when there was reason for fear. Devoted in ways that cost him something real, fallible, human, and more interesting for all of it than the legend had ever been. After 2017, Chuck Norris moved through his remaining years in a register the world had never quite heard from him before. Quieter, more reflective. The urgency of the crisis had passed. But it had left something behind, the particular kind of clarity that settles into a person after they have survived something that permanently reorders what matters. He made occasional public statements. He wrote about faith and about aging, and about what it feels like to arrive at a stage of life where the body slows but something else, something harder to name, deepens. He spoke about Gina's ongoing recovery with a gratitude that felt specific and earned rather than performed. He appeared in family photographs that circulated periodically, older visibly. The years present in his face in ways they hadn't been before, but still carrying that particular physical stillness that had always been the most recognizable thing about him. Not tension, stillness, the kind that comes from a person who has long since made peace with who they are. He was 86 years old when March 19, 2026 arrived. His family's statement, released in the hours following his death, was measured and full of love in equal proportion. They described a devoted husband, a loving father and grandfather, an incredible brother, and, in their own words, the heart of their family. They acknowledged what he had meant to the world, the martial artist, the actor, the cultural symbol, and then, gently and clearly, they named what he had meant to them. Something quieter. Something more essential than any of the public things. According to his family's statement, he had been surrounded by the people he loved. He had been at peace. He had not been alone. The cause of his death was not disclosed publicly, his family having asked for privacy in their grief. No official determination had been shared at the time of this script. What the family chose to offer to a world that had loved him in its own imperfect, complicated, decades-long way was simply that, the fact of his peace, the fact of presence around him at the end. And for a man who had spent so many years sitting beside someone else in their darkest hours, there was something quietly, almost unbearably fitting about that image. He had stayed. And when it was his turn, the people he had stayed for did not leave. Legends are built from the outside. They are assembled by audiences who need them, shaped by critics who analyze them, and hardened over time by the accumulation of moments that a culture collectively decides to preserve. Chuck Norris didn't set out to become a legend. He set out to show up consistently in every way available to him, and the legend formed around that consistency, the way stone forms around something solid at its center. The Chuck Norris jokes, the ones that swept the internet in the mid-2000s and elevated him into a kind of digital mythology, framing him as a force of nature beyond the reach of ordinary consequence, were always something more than comedy. They were a form of love. They were a culture reaching for the idea of a person who couldn't be undone, who held together when everything around them was falling apart, who remained against all odds and all reasons standing. He held together, but not in the way the jokes imagined. He held together through years of sitting beside his wife in rooms he never asked to be in, through the grief of spending a fortune and receiving only partial answers in return, through the long, unglamorous silence of stepping away from a career and an identity and simply being a husband, without cameras, without applause, without any of the external validation that his professional life had always provided. He held together across 86 years that began in poverty and instability and ended, according to the people who were in the room, in peace. There is a version of his story that focuses on the records and the films and the cultural impact, and that version is true and it matters. He changed what action cinema looked like for an entire generation. He carried martial arts into the living rooms of people who had never encountered it and made them care about it. He built a career on nothing but discipline and presence and a refusal to be invisible, which, when you consider where he started, is a genuinely remarkable thing. But the version of the story that stays, the one that rises quietly to the surface long after the tribute videos have finished playing and the comment sections have gone still, is the one set not on any film lot but on a ranch in Texas, in medical facilities, in European clinics, in the accumulation of days and nights that nobody filmed and nobody reported and nobody, including him, ever made a speech about. The version about a man who measured his own strength not in championships or box office totals, but in whether he stayed when staying was the only thing left to offer. He stayed, fully. For as long as it was needed and then for every year that followed. Beneath the mythology, beneath the decades of projected invincibility. Beneath every roundhouse kick and every knowing one-liner and every internet joke that insisted he was beyond the reach of ordinary human experience, the most essentially Chuck Norris thing Chuck Norris ever did was sit down beside someone he loved when she needed him most and refuse, quietly and completely, to move. The world lost him on March 19, 2026. But the people who were in that room, the ones his family described in their statement, the ones who were present when the silence finally came, they didn't lose him the way the world did. They had already received everything, every year of presence, every morning he chose them over whatever else the world was still offering. Every quiet decision made again and again without announcement to be the person in the room rather than the figure on the screen. That is not a small inheritance. That is, looked at honestly, everything that actually lasts.